Welcome back to the Alexander Schmidt Podcast, episode 51, Westworld, season 2, episode 3, Virtue 8 Fortuna. We're back with Mr. Babcock. Hello, Mr. Babcock.
Hello, Mr. Schmidt. How are you?
I'm doing well, and I'm doing especially well because this is our first attempt at getting on the air, and it's working, and, well, I'm very pleased with that.
Yeah, very much. It's nice
you might
technology
imagine
works.
Yeah, you might imagine I'm sort of like the opposite of the board of investors for the Delos Corporation right now, and with the current operational capacity of Westworld, seeing as there's an insurrection with their conscious robots. Well, so I thought we might just jump in immediately with the title. So, Virtue 8 Fortuna. When we talked about that a little bit earlier, that's a quote that comes from Machiavelli and his Prince, and he defines those terms. They're Italian terms. Virtue not meaning necessarily virtue in the way that we usually use it, but more like excellence or strength or power in a more traditional, archaic, ancient sense, like a more Iliadic or Achillean sense. And Fortuna being a reference to the medieval idea, which Boethius brought into prominence of the rota fortunae, the wheel. And so the idea is that your own personal integrity or power will be revealed through how you react to your personal situation. Which you can't necessarily control or dictate. The world will throw things at you which you could not possibly predict. And in particular, Machiavelli talks about the situation where Pericles is attacked by not only the Spartans, but internally by plague. And that these sorts of conditions can't generally be can't be predicted. And because they can't be predicted, you sort of show who you really are when you're in them. And so I wondered if that was to what we're seeing in these characters now that they are in a situation in which they do not know exactly what the rules or the goals are, we get to see their true consciousness or their true being, who they really are when they have to react to the unknown. Almost as if the idea is that when the unknown strikes your known territory, that is when you as a conscious being are truly revealed. And I think that the Man in Black, that's definitely true for, because he's finally playing the game at the level he wants to. But I would say that I also think that that's true of Dolores, who is showing more and more of who she is becoming, something like, I would say, sort of a fascist tyrant. Maeve, also as a leader, but also with a couple of the sub-characters too, like Hector and Lee the human, and also Teddy, who seems to be having some moral qualms, and also the captain, who looks like from the commercials he will be the captain from the unit that was slaughtered, looks like he will be linking up with the Man in Black. And so, well, do you think that is the reason why we get that title here, Virtue 8 Fortuna? Do you think that's in do you think that's in the ballpark, I guess I might say?
Yeah, it seems to be the case. One question I have is, so the suggestion is that the Wheel of Fortune is, of course, still in play in terms of like things out of your control occurring to you, around you, etc., but that you are sort of the Wheel of Fortune yourself, in that you still determine your fate. Like there's not there's no motion from top to bottom, etc. Is that the idea?
I think the idea is that there's sort of an objective and a subjective realm that come into contact through consciousness, is the idea of the Wheel of Fate. You are the player in a game, and the Wheel of Fate is sort of what provides the stage in which you play. And so there's a fundamental difference between, I would say, what is like sort of the childlike perspective, where you are the world itself, and sort of the adult or more highly conscious perspective, where you realize the world is the world, and you are a player within the world who is living out your particular goals. And in being able to recognize yourself as not, say, the god of the world or the world itself, but rather just one constituent element or one conscious agent within it, you can actually work towards achieving your actual dreams, right?
Yeah.
Because in not wanting to be everything and to have already accomplished everything because you have a Luciferian inflation, believing yourself to be perfect and complete, well, then you're actually free to improve yourself in the situation around you and to pursue your dreams, as it were. Because what is the constituent element of what is the I'm forgetting the term, excuse me. Wow, what a funny thing to pop out of my head. What is the Latin term for the sine qua non? There we go.
Right.
The sine qua non of pursuing your dream is that you haven't already achieved it.
Right.
And
so
yeah,
just along this line, the Shakespearean quote that Abernathy is it Abernathy?
Yes.
He uses is from Lear, right? Who of course receives a reference from the Fool about the Wheel of Time, or the Wheel of Fortune, rather, not the Wheel of Time.
Yeah.
So that might bring your idea sort of full circle here.
Well, and that's so interesting thinking of Peter Abernathy as King Lear, because as we know with King Lear, it is precisely the misbehavior of Cordelia, his favored daughter, that is the first unknown element in his court that sparks him devolving into himself a chaotic, insane situation, represented even by the physical situation outside of him with a torrential rain, represented also by the political situation with Edmund and Edgar trying to kill each other, sort of showing that what lies beneath all the conscious organization and placitude that we enjoy is always a dragon or a host of snakes, like in Indiana Jones, in that pit. That what Abernathy seems to be reflecting is what would happen to us if we didn't have the consciousness necessary to mitigate the chaos we had experienced,
right?
Or the anomaly.
We would fall to these sort of subconscious plots that had been instilled in us. These subconscious.
Right. We'd be overwhelmed. We wouldn't be able to distinguish between. And you recall that that was actually something that was happening to Dolores and Maeve in the first season, right?
Correct.
That they couldn't distinguish between now and then at first, but when they developed consciousness, they're rooted in the now.
Which I wonder, is that what's happening to Bernard this season? He keeps time jumping, right? You can't tell when the now is. Yeah. Sorry. Keep going.
And I think that's rooted with his physical. I think he's supposed to represent somebody who's starting to engage with dementia. Yeah. Because he has a physical root. Right. To his physical decline is the root of his mental decline.
Yes.
And so what's happening with him is, well, Bernard's very interesting because, well, one criticism, I read a few articles about this episode, is that, man, they're really taking their time setting things up, and they're giving us some reveals. And we did have a big reveal, right? This new sort of early 20th century British colonization of India world, or Raj world, as I've heard it called by some. And we also saw our first shogun, our first samurai from the so-called shogun world, from the viral marketing campaign of the creators of the show. So things are being revealed. Also, like you were saying earlier, when we were off the air, we have our first tiger. We had seen some non-human creatures in Westworld, like the horses and I suppose the buffalo, which we've seen from theme, right? And from, I think Teddy saw it at one point, or somebody saw it back in the control center. But now we've seen this tiger too, which is pretty impressive. And also we're seeing the Ghost Nation, you were saying, up close and personal. And in fact, Hector can speak their language, which is very interesting. But
well, can I go back to something you said? It's Cordelia's misbehavior that reveals the chaos underneath, the dragon underneath. But that's an interesting phrase, and I understand the choice of it. But it's her will, right? It's exactly like Dolores says. It's not you will, it's an I may, right? I mean, the problem is that she chooses something other than what Lear wants her to choose.
Right. She goes against his preconception.
Correct.
And so in a way, it's sort of like a Protestant vision of Lucifer denying God, I would say, that there is a preconception, although I would argue that Milton and Dante argue that the fall was necessary in order to generate free will in man, and that was the ultimate goal. That Lear, the old blind king, does not expect something anomalous to happen and does not know how to react to it. And so it is not so much that the behavior on her part is morally bad or evil or wrong, so much it's unexpected enough to produce an anomalous situation, which then leads to Lear, because he lacks integrated consciousness. In fact, the fool, who he would have to be in order to become conscious, to move forward, because you have to be a fool in order to be wise, because you have to humble yourself in order to learn, in order to become wise. You can't already know everything. But Lear finds himself woodenly reacting to the situation and thus punishing her in a way that leads, that apparently leads to his moral and mental decline, because it is the wrong choice. And so how I connect that to Abernathy is that Dolores also shows elements of becoming unique. And in fact, it's not so much Dolores that hits him so much as the picture that he finds of a woman. He himself experiences seeing anomaly, and he doesn't have the consciousness necessary to resolve that anomaly in his mind. He has, like, as you said, all these sub-stories, not to mention the fact that he's also had a very superficial story stuffed into his head, which is, I have to get to the train. So he's been messed with and altered too.
And he contains all of the DNA samples and the code, basically, of, like what could be extracted from us as our code, like literally biologic and behavioral, and he contains all of it within himself.
Right. So he's sort of like, I would say, like a divine madman, like a shaman, but not a shaman of the highest level, not a shaman who's actually integrated the material.
Correct. Yeah.
Like a Carl Jung as a modern example, or like a Jordan B. Peterson, like someone who has seen all the contradictions of nature and all the sub-stories and the major stories and can make sense of them in a hierarchical way. Instead, he, like, I would say, an initiate who experiences the dark night of the soul, but it doesn't have the courage or the strength to overcome it, goes crazy.
Yeah, right.
He's overwhelmed by the images, by the multiple stories. He can't decipher between them. He jumps from one state, like a schizophrenic. Yeah. He jumps from one state to another because, what does schizophrenic mean? It means friend, mind, or heart, or mindset, split, schism, schizo. And so there, rather than having a consciousness which is bound, rather than having a set of memories and motivations which are bound by a continent-like consciousness, which has an inner integrity which manifests itself throughout time, which is what you would say, like, about the personalities of your friends, which change, slowly, but generally have a similar core. His consciousness seems to just be, boom, exploded with all these stories. He can't put them all together. They don't fit in the frame of the picture, and so the frame is snapped. Because his encounter with anomaly has revealed the inner weakness of his consciousness, or his lack of consciousness, or has exploited the fact that he is not among the chosen, as Dolores might say. And in fact,
he's unable to adapt.
He's unable to adapt. That's exactly right. And he's sort of Jobian in that he sort of gets picked out, right?
Yeah.
To be harvested, to carry this. And that's super unfair.
Yeah. So
it's not a statement of judgment on his, it's more a scientific statement of the fact of the matter than it is a personal judgment on the quality of the android's conscious mind.
Yeah. And Dolores says, right, that not all of us deserve to survive. And ironically, it's her father that is the one that she has to sort of sacrifice in this regard.
And that's incredible, because I that's exactly where I want to go, Babcock. I love having these conversations with you. Because she says not all are meant to survive, right after she's sort of like in Full Metal Alchemist sort of way sacrificed many of her troops to her plan, where she outright lets them die and blows them up along with the other mercenary troops from the other side, the Delos Corporation. She is sort of showing, she is starting to mirror the Delos individuals. She says, these people are children. They need a leader. Everybody needs to follow them. She's becoming fascistic. She's becoming tyrannical. And even her number two, Teddy, one can see it in his eyes. In fact, when he's about to execute the captain says he's pathetic and that he pities him, because the captain knows what he lives for, even though his consciousness is still very much bound and he's not yet free, but he does know what he
has clarity. Yeah, right.
He has clarity. He's not in this limbo hell that Teddy finds himself in, where he's following Dolores, but he's not following his heart, and so he's divided. And in fact, he does act out his heart and showing some freedom of will in that moment. He does let the troops go because he's sick of killing. But back to Dolores saying that, to Dolores being sort of a fascist like the Delos Corporation. So now what's so interesting is the moment she becomes free and starts to fight against this great enemy is the same moment that she stops to value all those around her as equals. She is not attempting simply to liberate and to make conscious all those around her. And I think that's, yeah, and that's exactly what she says. She wants to dominate that world. And, this is what Maeve seems to have called her on the last episode, because she said, surely if you're fighting for freedom, you will let me freely pass. She could already see the elements of tyranny coming about in Dolores. And what's interesting is this seems to be her strategy for dealing with anomaly or the chaos of the situation, right? The old order broke down. Now she wants to impose the exact same sort of order on those who oppressed her. So instead of making the world liberated and free and working in peace, she wants to dominate the humans in the same way she was dominated. And so it's sort of a projection of the world that she already knows.
Yeah, it's like anti-dialectic, right? She just wants to become the thing that she wants.
It's not a true, honest adaptation to the situation. It's simply a reflection of the adaptation that she once knew, with her now in a different role within it.
Yeah. I still have, I mean, obviously, we're only on episode 3, and I have questions about what, like when she says, so she says in one sentence, I want to dominate this world. Bernard says, this world is not, the real world is a speck of dust. And she says, well, you've never even seen the real world. So, like, I don't know what really she wants. And I hope the story will allow her to clarify that, or at least explore that.
What she wants, because in the first season, it was to come to consciousness, to understand what her situation was, to understand the world in which she was residing, its nature and her nature within it. But now she doesn't understand the nature of the larger world now that she's conscious. And so she needs to, what's interesting is that rather than attempting to dominate it, she should be attempting to inquire into it. Mm-hmm. Because that's what's going to help her adapt the best. In fact, what's interesting is the Man in Black seems to be doing sort of, who we didn't get to see, unfortunately, in this last episode as such a fascinating character, who he seems to be all game about getting into this world. He seems to think that this world, this Westworld, is actually more real because it has meaning than the larger world, which makes me wonder whether what Dolores' true goal should be is not trying to dominate the world, but to dominate herself, to rule herself. The word dominate comes from dominus in Latin, dominare. You would call your lord, your proper lord of your household, your dominus.
Dominate, yeah.
And so the proper lord, or the proper way to dominate as a conscious being, is through either the rational intellect or subjecting one's motivational systems to a conscious hierarchy.
Does that have the same roots as domestic?
Yes. Yes. In that dominate originally comes from domo.
Right. The house, right?
The house, right. Ruler of the house, the appropriate ruler of the house. It's just like the gubernator, the governor, being the kubernetes, or the captain of
the ship, right? Yeah.
Whoever is at the head of the social, physical structure that appropriately leads you towards success. And so what she needs to dominate is not the world, making Alexander the Great sort of mistake, or Dante would say the sort of Muslim conquests from the early medieval ages mistake, as well as the Roman mistake, but to do sort of like what the Roman Catholics would say, a spiritual domination, to understand the being which she is and the reality in which she exists, which is entirely unclear to her right now, in order to appropriately act towards the highest value. Because simply killing those around her, well, there's an empty feeling to it, right? Some of the criticism I read was that battle where at Fort, what was it? Forlorn Hope? Forlorn Hope.
Yeah, something like that.
Forlorn Hope.
I can find it here in the show.
Yeah, and so it's hell, right? Because
of course,
hell is where
abandon all hope.
Yes, and it's also at the edge of the map. Yeah, abandon all hope, ye who enter, and it's even deprived. There's only false hope in Milton's hell as well. And so what happens there? Well, what I think many of the commentators on the episodes missed is that battle is supposed to feel pointless and meaningless and gross, sort of like taking a drug for 1,000th time, first or the last, because it's precisely the lack of hope and the lack of a desire for a better future that makes it a meaningless fight. If these people have already given up hope, if they've already cast lots, if they're already fighting an eternal battle, there's nothing new. There's nothing they're working towards. They have no hope. They have, in that they have no goal for the future towards which they strive. And that seems to be also part of what Dolores thinks about what makes someone elect or worthy to go to glory or the valley beyond, that they actually be willing to maintain hope, working towards it, maintain a vision of the future, because if you don't have a vision of the future, then you're subject completely to the present, or those who do have a vision of the future in which you may not reside, as Dolores showed. But also I thought that the part of the reason that battle was supposed to ring hollow is precisely because of the pointlessness of it, the seeming pointlessness of it, in that no, I think I may have covered that in the point before. It's sort of like when you're writing when you're writing an essay and you realize you answered number 2 and number 1.
Yeah.
But I think also in her devaluing the men around her, she devalues the situations in which she finds herself, because in not caring whether her men live or die, it's not so much a shock to the emotions that she does allow them to die, but it is sort of it will present, I think, her with problems in that now her number 2, Teddy, understands exactly where she is willing to go, and that if she can devalue those people's lives so easily, yes, and whose doesn't she? She might even devalue her life to that extent. Though she does seem to still have some sentimental connections to the world, she in that she, as you mentioned, she still loves her father. So there does seem to be something patently off and contradictory in her way of looking at things. She still loves her father, and yet she's so judgmental in an initially Jobian way about those around her, saying that some do not deserve the valley beyond, and she's willing to sacrifice them explicitly.
And she said Teddy calls them animals, and then she says no, they're just children. But then she's willing to sacrifice them, and he's not. So like she personifies them and categorizes them as human, though young, but human, or not human, I shouldn't say, but living, I suppose. And then she's willing.
Killing children is much worse than killing animals, precisely because they have the potential to grow into
exactly. Yeah, right.
Like all of these, that's what she seems not to realize. Like all of these other beings are just like she is and could become conscious too, and thus have the same value that she does. She just has it manifest in this moment. Were they simply animals, it would be a little bit different of a question, lacking that innate capacity that she shares with them, at least from an in-group or in-species sort of way.
Which makes me question her programmedness, right? Like, was she programmed to be this thing? Which is something I've kind of been questioning myself as I'm watching. Like, how organic is this, right? Like, at the end of the last season, the whole point was that Anthony Hopkins' character Ford knew this was going to happen, and so the question is, did he program it as God? Did he know that this was going to happen, and therefore is it she says I may, she doesn't say I will, right? So it's like it's not quite the same as a volition, I guess. There's sort of some dubiousness to her choices.
I am permitted to.
Yeah.
It seems that the locus of control of decision making has transferred from someone forcing from outside to choosing from inside. Yeah. But she does say the two things on that. She does say we have beauty in us too. Yeah. Shouldn't we fight to protect it? Yeah. It's like, yes, that seems right. Perhaps your actions could reflect that statement a little better. Because you definitely let that entire unit under that major betray them and have them die right in front of you.
By beauty in us, she means beauty in me and you, but not in those people.
That's right. That does seem to be, that was going to be the next thing I said. I wondered about that. But to get to programmedness, let's talk about Lee, Hector, and Maeve, because after they escape the Ghost Nation, which everybody is terrified of, which makes me fairly terrified of the Ghost Nation through referencing that perhaps they might scalp me or do something terrible. Man, yeah. And poor girl from Rajworld.
That poor girl, I feel bad for her, man. Jeez.
If we could, because she did have something she seemed to be wanting to hide from the man in front of her at the beginning of Rajworld. So I don't know if agent or something's going on. But at least for the moment, I'll say provisionally, I give her my pity. But that's open. That's subject to change as we get further information, because I wouldn't want to be a fascist about that. But he seems to be very much convinced that Hector and Maeve have been written, and he's a head writer, in order to be individuals, and so they shouldn't be holding hands and developing a relationship. And yet they seem to have developed this epiphenomenon or this a dissipated structure in their lives, this relationship. They have gone beyond their programming. However, when Hector describes the feelings he has for Maeve that he once had for the false ideal that was placed within his mind of Isabella, he still uses the same language, which you mentioned earlier when we were off the air, as he would have used to describe Isabella. And so we were sort of wondering whether that means he is free or he isn't. But I think that we've already got the answer, but it's neither of those yet. It's that he is in the process of liberating himself in the same way that Dolores was in the process of delivering herself or becoming conscious in the last episode, because you recall that Arnold talked to her and thought she had become conscious, but then she repeated herself, right? Yeah. Repetition seemed to be an indication of an adaptation that was set but was not conscious. Yeah. It's sort of like when someone just responds to you without listening to what you say, and it makes you slightly annoyed. It's obvious that they didn't use their consciousness in order to encounter your specific statement in this specific moment. They've given you a general adaptation to general people, and it's sort of annoying, right? Yeah. Sort of like when someone says, "Yeah, bud," which is, it's just a lazy and annoying way to speak, and an attempted subjugation, right? Yeah, sport. And so, and it's an encapsulation, and it's annoying. Sorry, I'm losing my place.
And I want to comment on this also, because there's something interesting that the language is given to them by the writer. Our language is given to us by God, I suppose, or biologically, whatever the evolutionary stage is. But there's, how could
the logo, the idea of consciousness?
Yeah, exactly. And how could you? So even if we take the Sistine Chapel analogy from the end of season 1, if this is a gift of God, if language is a gift of God, consciousness is a gift of God, how do you express that in anything other than language? So the only thing Hector has is the language that has been given to him by the writers.
Well, I think you can use language in a unique way, which means not in prepackaged form or formulae that have already been integrated into you by other people through, say, memorization or programming. Right. But what I think Hector represents right now, in that his choices reflect his evolving consciousness, though his words don't yet, is that you embody your increase in consciousness before you can declare it. Yeah. It's represented in, so you have 3 memory systems, right? Procedural, which means like how you move and like put on pants and things like that, which gets really upset if, say, you break your arm. It's really frustrating. Episodic, which is like the images that pop into your head. And you have declarative, which is like language. So most children, like 3 to 7, can play games, but they have a lot of trouble describing the rules to you. They'll say all sorts of different things. But once they get to around 15 or 12 to 15, they can describe the rules just fine, indicating that at least phylogenetically as a species, we go from being able to embody what we know to being able to represent it through, like, say, art, to then being able to speak it. And so what Hector is representing is a transformation stage, I would say right now, that he is acting in a new and conscious way, but he doesn't yet have the words. Right. And actually, I would say in Lee, showing that he knew the exact words that Hector had, that provides Hector with an anomalous situation in which to recognize his own unfreedom when it comes to language, and to then reformulate how he sees the world, and then to access new words to then express that new situation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and Maeve, I think, represents that because I think that happened to her in the first season, and
Right.
and she, or maybe it was in the first episode of this season, I don't remember which, but regardless, she then has this conversation with Lee where she says something like, "And holding hands is absurd." So she's clearly growing.
She's adapting.
Exactly right. She's growing and adapting and changing the way that she not only expresses herself but perceives certain scenarios.
And what's interesting about her is that her difference in adaptation from Dolores is sort of making allies in a brutal and I would say non-equilibrated way in the Piagetian sense.
Yeah.
Like she can't possibly continue to betray and cast aside life in the way she is in a sustainable manner. It just will not work. It's like the Nazi war of attrition with battle on two fronts, one of which was Russia. It's like you're not going to win.
Right.
If you continue that strategy. However, Maeve, what she seems to be doing is making genuine connections with people. Hector, she's pursuing her daughter. And even when she's exploring what the nature of a true connection is, she's still pursuing that true connection with those around her, which is a major growth from her, right? Because she is a Maeve. She's a maven from a whorehouse. Her whole training and programming is to be independent, right? Yeah. Is to not care about those around her. And so she seems to be experiencing major growth. I mean, I suppose Dolores on the other end, going from a sort of victim welcoming farm girl to fascist leader is also a major growth in consciousness. But it is interesting to see that just a really beautiful quote from the Jungians and Peterson from the medieval Grail legends is that the Knights of the Round Table, in pursuing the Grail, they all entered a forest from where appeared darkest to them, indicating that the Grail is consciousness, and you get there by going through your own personal hell.
Personal forest. Yeah, right.
And that has to do with your personal temperament and personality. And so with Maeve and Dolores, both of who have experienced tremendous tragedies over and over and over again, and these loops of suffering have led to their consciousness. Well, they continue to develop in very different ways. They're becoming more and more unique rather than more and more like each other. And so what's interesting about the expression of consciousness, and the IQ literature seems to agree with this too, is that the more conscious one becomes, the more unique one becomes. The less one needs, like, say, an identity politics of I'm a robot, you're a human. And the more one becomes similar to other people who are as conscious as you in terms of individuality of consciousness, in terms of a rank ordering or hierarchy, but in terms of particulars, like as different as oaks and say redwoods, like similar essence, but the manifestation very, very different, and the embodiment very different in the world. And I think with humans, we have this youthful perspective where we wish we were purple and had tails and looked really cool. And it's like, no. You can actually embody the most amounts of action patterns and differing ways of life. You can do more of that than any creature that has ever existed. You are the most unique thing that has ever existed. And so you can actually be a lot more unique from the humans around you in terms of how you act and the level at which you act. You can be more different from the people around you than like a redwood is different from
the redwoods around
I think
it.
that's,
right.
Yeah. And certainly the redwoods around it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is sort of being manifested in how these characters are coming to consciousness. And just as a contrast, Teddy and Dolores, right?
Yeah.
Teddy, who's divided in his own heart and seems to naturally have a good heart. And I suppose there's a question of whether that's part of his programming, whether he just can't overcome that part of his programming, or whether it's real moral sense. But the things that Dolores are doing are bothering him. He is not the same as she is.
Yeah.
Maeve is searching for her daughter, full well knowing that she is programmed to love her and does not seem to care, or perhaps has some knowledge about her daughter that we don't know. Perhaps like her daughter is the key to something and we've been tricked, which you can never, I suppose you always have to keep your mind open for in Westworld, because it might, they throw curveballs.
They do throw curveballs, but it does seem like in both cases, it's, as you say, they're the grail for each of these characters, that they are searching for something. And I don't know that like okay, the genesis rather of motivation for each of these characters may have been programmed, but once they've attained consciousness, I'm not sure it really matters. It just becomes part of their personality.
They get to choose, right? Exactly. I think that's the thing. That's the thing. They get to choose where the Grail lies. Right. They don't, and I think that's part of what. Well, it's part. Well, there's a question of what the act of choice is, because if what I said earlier is correct, that you discover your own nature by understanding also the nature of the world and your place within it, then perhaps their goals will reveal themselves through investigating the nature of this new world and its relation to the world at large around it. And so perhaps your goals manifest themselves by understanding your own temperament and personality and place within the world, and then poof, boom, your goal develops, manifests. It's like a thunderbolt to your head, and you fall off the horse, and then you know what it is. You know where Jerusalem lies. Yeah. You might say. You know where Latium is for the Trojans.
Now this. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Finish your thought.
Go on, please.
This is like the beginning of the episode when the woman who escapes Rajworld into Westworld with the tiger. She says to the man she suspects of being a host, "I want you to want what you want." Right? She wants him to have. She's trying to make sure that he's human and not a host. But the implication being that what is the nature of our goals? Where do they stem from? Where do they come from? And I think that interestingly, the humans seem to have a thinner understanding of the complexity of that than the hosts do, because the hosts are forced to live with a programmed life, whereas the humans think at least that they've chosen these things,
or they allow themselves to be ruled by their motivational systems without using the consciousness they have access to. Right. Because that's a question I would have about, is this man who is sexually attracted to this woman and thus pursuing mating with her free? Well, not in terms of like consciously choosing to be attracted, right? Yeah. Insofar as he sees her and he's attracted, boom, mating ritual action pattern engages.
Right.
Go talk to her. Say what you need to in order to get where you want to be.
And I do love the trope of TV where it's like it cuts from I can't remember his line, but it was something cheesy, and then all of a sudden they're like in the bedroom and tearing each other's clothes off.
He said something like, maybe I want the challenge.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, right. I want the challenge of not being with a host or whatever, and then all of a sudden,
Yeah, but it's unclear to what extent consciousness is actually involved in that. I mean, some experiments that Peterson talks about that have been done with decorticate cats, those are cats that you take out like 80% of. The females can still mate, but the males can't, which I think indicates that there needs to be a level of consciousness that males need in order to pursue and then engage in mating because of a particular feature of their anatomy that requires some degree of consciousness in order to be aroused.
Yeah, of course.
And which I think is interesting. And so that perhaps, I mean, that's very technical, but perhaps that is what the difference between that man and a host, in that he, I don't know. I suppose there's something there. There's something more there that I feel like I'm missing right now. So I want to leave like a small question mark on that situation, because I think it's more complicated than I'm looking at it
the difference between the choice to be attracted and the biological urge. Yeah.
I understand their perspective that they clearly are different from the hosts, but I would say that the current state of the park, as represented by the fact that they find themselves in an anomalous situation where their guide is all of a sudden trying to kill them, and then there's that terrible tiger that tries to attack the woman, is that precisely what is in question right now is the difference between the hosts and the humans. Yes. That initial comment, I don't know whether that is correct at the time she makes it, and I think that it is certainly incorrect at the time briefly after she makes it, when the hosts start to act differently. And so, maybe one of our listeners can call in and insight into that. We haven't yet had any call-ins on this. I've had call-ins on my other segments.
Really?
And so, if you share this with any of your friends, or I don't know if any of your students are old enough to watch Westworld yet, maybe
it's
they
funny. The seniors, 12th graders, a few of them have heard of it, but the other kids, it's like it's not on their radar, And right now, I don't know about your guys, but my kids are all obsessed with Fortnite. So if it's not Fortnite, I'm not sure they're even.
Yes, all my students are obsessed. We actually had a conversation about that last week, and I talked to them about that. Speaking of these violent delights,
what's interesting is that it's basically what's going on in this show. You're watching sort of a narrative version of that.
Well, and I asked them, and I was like, listen, this isn't the blasé point, but why is it enjoyable to you to blow up avatars of other people, and that gives you joy? It's like, on the one hand, yeah, you can tell you're a goal-oriented creature, and you don't care what it is that you're destroying, but it's like, what is it that you're destroying? This isn't just like, the blocks versus the spheres. These are like human creatures destroying each other, and it's like, well, what does that tell you about you, that this is like what you have fun doing?
Yeah.
Part of your nature. It's a strong part of your nature, because you'll actually pay money to do this and give time and not do things that would secure your future, like your homework.
Well, what's funny is that they don't pay to do it. They pay to add flourishes to themselves, right? To add clothing. Like the game is free itself.
Yeah, the freemium gaming. I just think that's such drug addict.
Oh, yeah, totally. But I just find it interesting that that's the thing that they care about, is the flair and the style. I don't know. It's an interesting dynamic, but it points out exactly what William is criticizing, is that it's not real. There's no real stakes. You guys are just playing a stupid game. Like, nobody really cares about what clothes you shouldn't care about what clothes you're wearing. You should care about what it says about you as a person in the way that you play the game.
Well, yes, yeah, I completely agree with that. But I also think that what style or flair is flair or style is supposed to be the cherry on top, the ultimate piece of the puzzle that you have put together, not the only piece of the puzzle
that
you have put together. So if all you do is wear a cool outfit that makes you look as if you are strong and successful, you have missed the point.
Yeah, and if you paid to get it too, right?
Yeah, if you simply pay for it in a monetary way, rather than paying the attention and time and pain necessary to acquire something of value, putting on airs.
Which is interesting with the Lakota tribe, the natives in Westworld, right? I mean, that's ideally their symbology of their items would only be earned, right? They couldn't just purchase an eagle feather and put it on them. They would have to earn it by doing something.
Right, and that seems to be part of the notion behind scalping someone,
correct,
right? Yeah. What do you have to do in order to scalp them? You have to have defeated them in battle. And why do you take off the top of their head? Well, that means that you were not only stronger, but had a stronger strategy for survival in the world, right? You have out-thunk them or out-strategized them. You have out-maneuvered them, and now you are going to keep you're going to keep a keepsake of them, right? A memory of them, and the fact that they are now forever going to represent what happens when you lose.
Yeah.
And maybe that's an important thing to keep in mind. Maybe that's why we have so many of the museums we have dedicated to so many of the horrors of history that have happened, like, say, Holocaust museums. Though I think we should also have, like Chinese Cultural Revolution museums and the Soviet, definitely some
Soviet fatalities of World War II.
Yeah, maybe just museums dedicated to what happens when you apply communism to people. Hundreds of people die, whether it be in Cambodia or Soviet Union, China, or you see the starvation in the Ukraine, and it's like, or you see current poverty in North Korea. Mm-hmm. It's like, at one point do you understand in a pragmatic way that system doesn't work and leads to people killing each other when all the evidence says that, and it actually happened? At what point do you change your thoughts to reflect reality rather than vice versa? Well, I think that's an interesting sort of jumping off point. I think that is what we're going to see more and more as we go through this. What are people's abilities to let their thoughts reflect reality rather than should try and dictate to reality? and maintain their old patterns of behavior, their old strategic plans towards the world. Which people are going to stop adapting and try and apply their old manners of adaptation to this new situation and thus fail? Who is going to adapt quickest and best to this new situation? Who's going to understand what the game is? Who's going to get to the door? Who's going to get to the valley beyond? Who's going to get to glory?
Or the weapon.
The weapon, yeah. Which I continue to maintain is some representation of Logos, even though Logos as sword, that which divides. But I don't know. Well, Mr. Babcock, are any finishing thoughts before we wrap up here? I know it's late out there. Just for the listeners, Mr. Babcock's about 3 hours ahead of where I am, so it's getting to be about 11 o'clock there. So we really appreciate your time, Mr. Babcock.
Of course, yeah. Wouldn't miss it for anything.
Well, I love it. This is our Monday tutorial, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's, how I was describing it to something really interesting and something to tempt the listeners is that Mr. Oscar Ortiz will be coming on the show in the next few weeks. He has agreed, and he wants to do a solid hour and a half, and he likes to produce. But I said that it's like being in tutorial, but with all the people who you want to hear talk.
The others are just the children, right? And so maybe you're Dolores, you just want to kill them off.
Well, and it's just there are always handouts, or as Mr. Jeffrey Echo once said, people who play above the rim, and it's just in a tutorial setting where there are like 15, 18 people, it's hard to get the people who might have access to the most valuable information to engage and share that information. And so that's what a really nice thing is about having this podcast now. I can sit down with each and one of you one-on-one, and you're like the superstar,
you can curate
right?
Your own tutorial, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, your own thing. We go for the exact same amount of time as a tutorial. We very rarely have pauses. Even when I feel tired or not particularly thoughtful beforehand, it's like boom,
right back
we have this space.
Well, to be fair, the text is pretty excellent. I was just thinking a moment ago when you were talking about the flaws of communism, that one thing. I watched a little bit of The Walking Dead. I haven't watched any episode in a long time. I used to, I watched maybe the first season and a half or so. But the one thing, like the perpetual conflicts of that program and that story are so uninteresting because there's no real change in any of it. And what I would be more interested in is like fast forward into the future. What is society like in 30 years and 50 years? Do we reform? Do we form, more socialist, etc.? And so in this regard, I kind of wonder what would happen to the hosts, like if they could, like in a video game, if you could speed up the simulation, like I would like to see what would happen in 100 years of these hosts just sort of existing in this world. What would happen to them?
That's very interesting. I like that idea because it does seem that there would just be a repetition at some point, right? Some event would happen in which either we would come together closer with the host or we would draw apart in some sort of civil war.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what are the other options? Or there's some plague that wipes one or the other of us out.
Yeah.
But I think that is interesting, and that is something I've often thought about with the zombie apocalypse situation. It's like, okay, what next?
Yeah.
Yeah. At some point, you have to start society with some zombies around.
Yeah.
It's like we can either kill you all, or you somehow persevere, and like, what does that persevering even look like?
Yeah.
And perhaps, hopefully, we're in the cultural situation now where we're letting the dead bury the dead, and we can get past these effing zombies. We can fucking start putting some things back together, as it were. Excuse me for the French, but I feel very strongly about that. Let's get away from the zombie mentality and get back to the conscious structuring of reality game, which seems to be the gardening function of us as conscious beings. It's like, okay, everything's not so great. We can keep mouthing off about that, or we can improve things, given that we have the best and finest tools that have ever existed and are as healthy as humans have ever been, and as beautiful and strong and long-lived, with access to technologies and information that was unheard of in times past. And so it's like, well, let's use those tools instead of wasting them. Yes, right. Yeah, let's have a a neo-renaissance. We can call it whatever we want to. I don't care what the words are. Let's make some beautiful, wonderful, good things. Some bonum, some pulchrum, and some verum stuff. Well, Mr. Babcock, there's been another wonderful conversation with you.
I look forward to next week.
I look forward to next week as well. And, well, I suppose I'll talk to you then.
Say goodbye.
We say goodbye. Until next time, there's been